In Chapter 14, we talk about population ecology. So, ecology is one of the most interesting areas of biology, and ecology is the study of the interaction of organisms with two things, with each other and with their environment. We can study ecology at multiple levels. One possibility is that we study ecology at the level of the individual organism, which is certainly interesting. And so, in this case, we study what does the organism eat, where does it live, how does it reproduce, and how does it interact with other organisms in its environment. Another possibility is that we study ecology at the level of the population. And so we define, as you recall from earlier in our course, a population as a group of animals that live together and all consist of one species. So a population is one species living in a particular area, such as the population of squirrels that live here on campus. We can also study ecology at the level of the community. And so we define a community, as we look at the bottom of our screen there for an example, as the group of populations that live together within a certain area. And so, as the example illustrates that we have on our screen, we have a number of different populations of fish residing in this coral reef, and together they constitute a community. Finally, we can study ecology at the level of the ecosystem. And so the ecosystem includes both the community and the non-living parts of the environment. Common non-living parts of the environment that we like to examine are things like sunlight and water and minerals. And so all these things make a tremendous difference in terms of the populations of animals that we will find in a particular ecosystem. I mean, perhaps the most prominent example would be comparing a desert, which would receive less than 10 inches of rain per year, to a tropical rainforest, which could quite easily receive over 150 inches of rain per year. And so the organisms that we find in those two areas, both plants and animals, are completely different as a result of the non-living parts of the environment, in this case, primarily water. One of the first things we typically think about when we think about studying ecology is determining the size of a population. And so populations can be measured in multiple ways. One possibility is we can do just a basic census. We can look at all the individuals that are present in a particular area and count them. So we do censuses here, of course, in the United States on a regular basis, 10 years if I'm not mistaken. And if we're dealing with organisms in the natural world, if we are dealing with plants, then it's very common very possible that we could use a census to simply quantify all the organisms that are present in a particular area. It's unlikely that those organisms, trees for instance, are going to run away from us and be hard to find. If we're dealing with animals, then it's a different scenario. And so it's quite difficult to go out into an ecosystem and simply count all of the, for instance, deer that are present in that ecosystem. Deer are very wary organisms. They move around quite a bit. They remain hidden much of the time, so it would be very difficult to count all those. So what's often done in those scenarios is something referred to as a mark recapture study. And so in this particular case, we mark a certain percentage of the individuals, we release them into the environment. Those marked individuals mix with their friends, with their counterparts in the environment that are not tagged, that are not marked, and then we go back at a later time and we make a second collection. And we calculate the number of organisms that are marked versus not marked within the sample that we collect. As it turns out, the higher the percentage of marked organisms, the smaller the population actually is. Because, of course, as you would imagine, if the population is quite large and we mark those same number of organisms, then in our recaptured efforts, we would collect a smaller number of the marked organisms because they simply have more organisms to mix with, and we're only collecting so many. This is very commonly used in certainly in wildlife, but also in the fish world. And so what I have on the screen is an example from the world of fish. It's been several years ago, but I participated in a mark recapture study when I worked for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so at that time, we put little electronic tags in 50,000 brown trout. That's what's being done on the left-hand side of our screen. These fish were released into the Cumberland River in Kentucky, a little bit south of where we are. And then over the next several years, electrofishing surveys were done. That's what's being depicted in the lower right-hand side of our screen. So we go out on boats and put electricity into the water, temporarily stunning the fish, capturing them. And that's our recapture method. We calculate the number of the number of marked organisms in the recapture, and that gives us a good idea of the population size. Another possibility is that you could do this with insects, such as beetles, like we see in this illustration from our textbook. In this case, you place a little paintbrush mark, a little paint mark on the back of these beetles. You release the beetles into the environment. You use the trap that's found in the middle picture of our diagram to get your recaptured organisms. And you look at the number of marked organisms in the second sample, and that gives you the idea of the population size. The next thing we want to talk about is something referred to as dispersion. How an organism is dispersed in the environment. How is it arranged, in other words, in the environment? And in ecology, we talk about three classic dispersion patterns. One of these is something referred to as a clumped dispersion. And so in this particular case, what we see is that organisms are grouped together in these clumps around suitable resources. So our book is using cattails as an illustration of this. If we look at the far left-hand side of the pictures found in the bottom of this slide. Cattails, as you likely know, only grow where there's sufficient soil moisture. And so this means that like we have in the picture, you have clumps of cattails where there's sufficient moisture and no cattails in other areas. Another possibility is a uniform distribution. The penguins pictured in this diagram in the middle, this picture in the middle of our slide, are displaying a uniform distribution pattern. And so these female penguins are sitting on eggs, and they're very aggressive. They reach out and peck each other if they get close enough to one another. And so this means that each female spaces herself just perfectly far enough away from the females around her so they cannot reach her. And so there's great competition for nesting space here. All these females are sitting on eggs, and the best spots are closest to the water. So the biggest females get the spots closest to the water. The smaller, less aggressive females end up further away from the water. But as a result, what we observe is a uniform distribution. We typically see a uniform distribution when there is fierce competition for limited resources. The final possibility, as far as dispersion goes, is a random distribution. And so in a random distribution, what we notice is that we have plenty of resources and the organisms spread out in the environment in a completely random fashion. So the conifer, the pine tree that we have on our slide here, is a good illustration of an organism that exhibits this random distribution, showing up in places in the environment that are seemingly unrelated to the environmental variables. A good example in the animal world would be a wolf spider, those nice big hairy spiders that you find in your basement from time to time. Those guys do not build webs, but they are predators of insects that roam from place to place. And so they typically take on a random distribution. So clumped distributions are found where the habitat is not uniform but only suitable in certain areas. The uniform distribution is found where we have fierce competition for limited resources, and then the random distribution is found where we have abundant resources and organisms orient themselves randomly within the environment. If we look at the frequency of these distributions in the natural world, what we notice is that clumped would be most common, uniform, second most common, and then random would be the least common distribution that we observe in the natural world typically. As we think about ecology, one of the aspects of populations that we're most interested in studying is population growth. And as we start to consider population growth, it's interesting to look at the history of human population growth here on planet Earth. And so what we see on the screen is an estimation of the population size of humans here on Earth going back about 10,000 years. And you can see very easily as you scan across this graph from left to right that humans have exhibited something that's referred to as exponential population growth. And so exponential growth is something we define as growth in ever-increasing increments. And so we think about this in terms of the growth of a population of animals because Each organism produces offspring, and as the population grows in size, that means you have a greater number of animals that are producing offspring, so the rate of population growth increases proportionately with the size of the population. We certainly see that happening with human population growth. As illustrated here on the screen, this graph, of course, is not quite up to date, and so we know that in 2021, we're really close to 7.8 billion people here on the face of the earth. So what we see is this, that as we pause here for a moment to think about human population growth, our book talks about where this population growth is occurring. And so historically, population growth was relatively low, but has increased in rate as the population size here on Earth has grown. Now, the graph on the screen breaks down where this population growth is occurring. The countries that are shown in red are the countries that we refer to as more developed countries. And so these are countries in which we find greater access to technology. And as a result of that, we typically see greater access to things like clean water and waste disposal. And so these countries are most suited to actually handle additional growth. But disturbingly, what we notice is this, that most of the growth that occurs here in the human population occurs in what we refer to now as less developed countries that are shown in blue on the screen. These are countries where there's less access to technology and therefore less access to one of the very most important things. One of the things that if we could provide this to a human population, we could save more lives than nearly anything else, and that is very simply clean water. And so in these less developed countries, the population growth has continued to increase. And so if we look closely at the screen, we see a slight leveling of the population growth in more developed countries, but certainly a very distinct increase in the less developed countries in the recent decades. Furthermore, what we notice is this. So our book is discussing this and not attempting to predict the future, but we do notice that if we look back at the history of what we refer to as more developed countries today, we've always noticed this distinct trend. And so the first thing that happens, as shown on our slide as we go from left to right, is that the death rate in the human population drops. This is the result of what I mentioned earlier, access to clean water and also access to modern medicine. So things like antibiotics and vaccines protect humans from diseases that used to kill a tremendous number, especially of young human beings. But access to these things and the requirements for vaccinations, for instance, in these developed countries, have in some cases nearly eliminated these diseases from the population entirely. In the case of smallpox, the disease is gone from the face of the earth, except for in a couple places where it's stored. The second thing that we notice is this, that we've always then observed a decline in birth rate in those particular countries. And so why that is more of a sociological question, but it's something that's always been observed up to this point. And it is worth noting that decline in birth rate has always been associated with an increase in the literacy rate of the population. And so overall, those two things together, I don't think anyone would argue that a decline in death rate is a bad thing, but those two things together are really good news for the population as a whole because it guarantees that there will be sufficient resources for that population as you move into the future. So as we look at the world today, your book talks about the fact that perhaps this is what we really need to look at and think about as we think about the future of the population here on Earth. And perhaps assisting these less developed countries in their transition to developed countries will really help with this problem of population growth that potentially presents a problem as we move forward here on the Earth. Only a problem, I mentioned, because no one, to the best of my knowledge, is arguing that we have unlimited resources to support an unlimited number of people here on Earth. So eventually we will reach carrying capacity. As we'll see in these coming slides, we understand from the study of ecology that every population eventually does hit carrying capacity. Now, the thing we have going for us as humans is this, that we have the ability to adjust our carrying capacity. So we have the ability to think and plan and use technology to our advantage to increase the number of people that can exist here on Earth. So hopefully, the future there is quite bright. Now, moving on then to this topic that we just mentioned, carrying capacity, what we see is this, that any population, whether we're talking about bacteria or human beings, given unlimited resources, will go through these various stages of growth. At first, we go through exponential growth, which is depicted on our screen, and I'm pointing to with the cursor here. And so this is the growth in ever increasing increments that we've talked about over the past few slides. And then we level out right at carrying capacity. So carrying capacity represents the number of organisms that can be supported by that particular ecosystem. Now, it should be pointed out that reaching carrying capacity as humans is not something that we want any part of, because when we reach carrying capacity, the slowing of that growth is caused by something we refer to as density-dependent factors that we'll be expanding on here in this chapter momentarily. So these are not nice factors. This includes running out of food, running out of water. It includes things like pathogens, which spread more easily in these dense populations. But some of these factors eventually cause the population to level out at this size that the population can support, that we refer to as carrying capacity. Now, here we build on this idea of these density-dependent factors. These are the factors that determine carrying capacity. And these are not fun factors, as you see here. So what are some examples of density-dependent factors? So one would be limited food supply. Look at this poor deer that we see on the screen. You can count those ribs and see the sunken abdomen there. So this deer is in the process of starving to death, and it is an illustration of what happens with this limited food supply. We also have increased risk of disease at high population levels. And so, I mean, why are you wearing masks as a result of COVID? To prevent the spread of disease when you're in tight areas. Disease, of course, spreads much more easily, all types of disease, when organisms are bunched closely together. We also have an increase in waste levels that occur. And so, especially for very small microorganisms that are growing in a confined area, this can eventually be the density-dependent factor that limits their growth. So these factors will cause multiple things. It could cause an increase in death rates simply as a result of starvation or as a result of death resulting from disease. It can also cause a decrease in birth rates. We see this very clearly in the white-tailed deer that's depicted on the screen. So white-tailed deer, the normal scenario is to produce 2 eggs that are fertilized and then develop into 2 fawns that are running around. You've seen fawns probably already this year. But under extreme malnutrition, what you do notice is that one of those embryos is resorbed. And so there's only one offspring that's born. There's a very easily measurable and has been demonstrated multiple times, correlation in white-tailed deer and most other organisms between the fertility rate or the fecundity rate and the nutritional status of those organisms. Now, on the other hand, we also have density-independent factors that influence population size. However, these factors are not influenced by population numbers. These are things like droughts, temperature extremes, natural disasters, a volcanic eruption, perhaps. These things influence population size, but they have nothing to do with how many organisms are present in the population. On this particular slide, we see a good example of a density-independent factor that limited population size. This is Mount St. Helens in Washington State that erupted in 1986. And so if you look at the top picture, then the red circle is circling 2 men that are standing in the forest with all of these trees that have been knocked down. And so this was an explosive eruption that flattened trees for hundreds of square miles near the center of that eruption. And so all of, let's take an animal, the elk that lived in that area. All the elk were killed, and it wouldn't matter if there was 2 elk or 2,000 elk. All of those would have been killed by that particular blast. Therefore, we refer to that eruption as a density-independent factor. The size of the population had nothing to do with how many organisms were killed. And so what we do notice is that it is density-dependent, not density-independent factors that do determine the carrying capacity of a particular ecosystem. Now, we move on to this particular topic, which is interesting in our discussion, age structure. As ecologists, we're very interested in looking at the age structure of a population because it tells us something about what's happening to the population and tells us what the future of the population will look like. Now, what we've done on the screen is to divide these populations up into pre-reproductive individuals, shown at the bottom in green. These would be the children. Reproductive individuals, these would be, for instance, parents, shown in yellow, I suppose. And on the top, we have the post-reproductive individuals, perhaps the grandparents here, shown in pink. And so as we look across at these three examples, we can tell something about what's happening to the population. The one on the far left is a growing population, expanding in size, because all of these children will move up, assuming constant mortality rates, will move up into the reproductive age here. And so they will produce children, and that means the green base will be broader when if this number of parents, shown in yellow, is producing this number of children, if we expand the yellow, which are the parents, it will definitely expand the green underneath that. So the far left diagram, the pyramid shape, represents an expanding population. Conversely, the far right diagram illustrates a shrinking population. So this number of parents is producing this number of children. When these children make their way up to be parents, then if current trends continue, they will produce even fewer offspring and the population will shrink in size. And lastly, we have a population that's stable here in the middle. So we have the parents are exactly replacing themselves in the environment. And so this population we would predict to remain stable over time. So again, far left to far right, increasing in size, middle population stable, far right decreasing in size. And these are age structure diagrams, and we can tell what's happening in a population by examining these. Here we see age structure diagrams from two countries, South Africa in 2000 and the United States in 2000. And so what we notice is that South Africa, as a country that's less developed than the United States, has more of an expanding population structure, similar to the far right left that we see on this particular slide, whereas the United States is closer to this stable population that we see in the middle there. And so it's simply a difference that we see in our world today. As we discussed previously, it's likely that'll change in the future. If we look back in history at the past of the European countries and the some North American countries and Asian countries, then their population structure will look quite different in the past than it does today. So one of the key topics in ecology are these things referred to as survivorship curves. Essentially, we can define survivorship curves by saying that each organism replaces itself in the environment, but it approaches that replacement in different manners. So let's talk about what we have here. There are three ways that organisms can replace themselves in the environment. Three strategies, I mean. So they can exhibit a type 1, type 2, or type 3 survivorship curve. Let's do the type 1 survivorship curve first. So in a type 1 survivorship curve, let's look at our graph on the upper left-hand quadrant here. We have the number of survivors on the y-axis. We have the percent of lifespan on the x. So if you're a type 1 survivorship curve organism, I'm pointing out this red line with the cursor, then you are very likely to survive the full extent of your lifespan and die at an old age. Organisms that exhibit this type of lifespan are typically organisms that we think of as they're large mammals or large raptors. Sometimes large reptiles, but most of the time mammals or raptors. So think about an elephant as an example. An elephant has one offspring at a time, has one offspring every 2 years at the most frequent. And the elephant devotes a lot of care to that offspring. You don't want to go up and try to ride the baby elephant with the mother standing around. It's not likely you're going to survive that because she is providing a tremendous amount of care to make sure that that baby makes it to adulthood. So a type 1 survivorship curve animal, an elephant. Now your book does use fescue as an example of a type 1 survivorship curve organism, which is an interesting choice. But it is a very long-lived grass and is a reasonable example from the plant world. But we'll stick with animals in our examples. Now, on the other hand, we have the complete opposite is a type 3 survivorship curve organism, shown in blue on our diagram. And so with a type 3 survivorship curve organism, it's an interesting strategy. If humans were a type 3 survivorship curve organism, then they would produce offspring that were perhaps a quarter of an inch in height. So just maybe 5, how much would that be? About 6 millimeters, in height. and they would produce just hundreds of those, and they would send them out into the environment. Most of those would not make it, but a very small number would, and they would replace themselves in that particular manner. And so what we see is that organisms like insects, such as the mosquito found on the screen, or fish, or most of our amphibians, all fall into this type 3 survivorship curve pattern. And so take a carp as an example. A large carp, which is perhaps 2 feet in long, which is not in length, which is not too big for a carp, will produce 1 million offspring in a single year. And of those million, only a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage will make it to adulthood. And that's what we see illustrated by this blue curve. If you're a type 3 survivorship curve organism, you're making tons of babies. You're throwing them out there in hopes that just a couple survive. It's very unlikely, if you're a young type 3 survivorship curve organism, that you will survive to adulthood. Now, on the other hand, the last type of curve we have is a type 2 curve, shown in yellow here. If you're a type 2 curve, you're something like the lizard that we see on the screen. You're intermediate in size. A number of things eat you, but not everything eats you. You produce a moderate number of offspring, and so you might live to be to old age, or you might not. But you're not all going to be eaten when you're little. And so things like moderate-sized mammals, songbirds, moderate-sized reptiles fall into this particular category. Squirrels and rabbits, for instance, would fall into this particular category. Rabbits do have a high fecundity, produce a lot of offspring, but they don't produce 1 million offspring per year, as does a carp. So the take-home message is that each organism that we see in the environment replaces itself. They might do it by producing one offspring and providing a lot of care to that offspring, which would be a type 1 organism, or they might do it by just making a whole bunch of offspring, knowing that most of those will die, but they can't all die. A few will survive. That will be a type 3 survivorship curve offspring. So interestingly, there are multiple ways by which organisms can replace themselves in the environment. We close the chapter with a return to the discussion of carrying capacity, in particular, the carrying capacity of humans here on the Earth. So there is some uncertainty about the future of human population growth, as we mentioned previously. It is true that human population growth is slowing somewhat, but only in certain populations, as we mentioned before. On the screen, we have 3 projections for what the population of humans here on Earth are going to look like in 2050. So the lowest estimate here, and I will mention, given that our version of the text is a couple of years old, we've already exceeded that. And so we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.8 billion at this particular point. The medium growth rate projection is for 8.5 billion, and the high projection is for 10 billion. And so it's certainly, that these different projections certainly have profound implications, not for the fortunate people who reside in developed countries, but for people who reside in these developing countries where resources are already limiting. And so as an entire species, humans, we look at this with great interest and great compassion and being concerned about what will happen to all of us here on Earth. Because we do realize, as illustrated by this example of from the natural world, that there are limits to any ecosystem, to the number of organisms that can be supported. So here we have a famous example of some reindeer, 11 reindeer, in fact, which are essentially very similar to caribou, were introduced into an island off the coast of Alaska. There were no predators to control them on this island, and so you see that the population over a 30-year period spiked from 11 all the way up to over 2,000. And then, as they killed all the trees in the island, suddenly there was this tremendous crash in population size, down to nearly zero in around 1950 there. So the laws of ecology are applicable both to animals and to human populations, and we look at them with great interest as ecologists. We look at both of those topics with great interest as ecologists.